So it's interesting in many ways coming back into the village and seeing the changes, although at the same time, in terms of visibility, it hadn't changed very much. It was still bush houses. And they still were far from roads. In fact, they were further from the outside world because of the closing of the airstrip than they ever had been. There was a weekly boat that came up the coast, and that had not been there before. And that's it carries some cargo, and that's the main way people get into the area and out of the area. If I have the privilege of going back, there's no doubt the way that I will go. But it's such a change. When we were first there in '81, there were 5 flights into the Wanagala airfield every week, and now it's closed. And much of the infrastructure in that area is gone. It's in jungle. So things change. We arrived right at the time that the Maisin were holding probably the biggest ceremony they had held in half a century. And this had been organized by my older brother, George Savaru, who was a very respected chief, big man, what have you, in the community. His eldest son had been killed by a gang in Port Moresby, where his son was working, and a year earlier. And several of the important seniors in his clan had also died. And so over the course of the year, they had been in mourning. And by total coincidence, we arrived right at the time that they were doing a special feast to mark the end of mourning period for the community. And it was an interesting experience because it was by far the biggest ritual I'd ever seen in this place. And there was so much about it that was shaped by newness. So it actually had an MC, a master of ceremonies, who had a megaphone, who would shout out to people in the Maisin language what was going on and what was going to happen next. It involved lots of people coming from neighboring communities where this family had connections, coming in traditional outrigger canoes that are all made locally from dugout logs and all the rest of it, bringing in traditionally made clay pots, cooking pots from Wanagala, live pigs, string bags, and also cartons of rice and tinned fish and instant ramen noodles and all these other kinds of things as well. So a real mix of kind of past and present. And the other thing that was quintessentially Maisin about it was that every day there was a near disaster. And every day the men would sit together and they would argue incessantly about what would need to happen, because things have to be worked out through consensus. And that was still going on, that kind of thing with this. And so on the one hand, it looked much more organized than I could recall ceremonies before, but it really wasn't. And the importance of consensus and of balance was still very, very much there. And it really brought home to me just how much this carries through. Now, since that time, even though the National Court ruled that outside logging companies needed to keep out, they have continued to try to come in. And the Maisin have worked with other of the other 5 language groups in the Bay to come to a consensus to bring people together to prevent this kind of robbery, basically, of the trees. And it's been fascinating to watch that. These are traditional enemies. These are people who have lots of stories of fighting each other and wiping each other out and stuff like this. But they've come together for a common cause. And at the same time, there's still many members of the community that would like to see logging because they think it's their only chance to get money. So it's a mixed kind of bag. But the larger consensus has been to keep them out. And it's been fascinating to watch as this area has become in some ways more isolated, in some ways more connected to the world. So it's become more isolated in terms of getting there, but people now have cell phones. And one of the things that started to develop in recent years when cell phone coverage came up is that there's almost like what in the Second World War was called coast watchers. And coast watchers were Australians who stayed behind Japanese enemy lines in the bush, and they would watch for incoming ships and planes, and they would report those back to the Allies. Well, the Maisin and the neighbors now have coast watchers. If a barge comes in with logging equipment into the bay, it gets reported back, and then it gets reported into a worldwide network of the people that they've worked with before. And they've been very, very good at kind of shaming the government into stopping these things before they get too far along. So it's been kind of a face-off going on the last decade. In 2014, they won a second national court battle against a logging company that claimed that they had a right to come into that area. And it's at that point I thought, we really need to update this story. There's an opportunity here to correct a few things I wish I had written about before in the earlier edition, and so on and so forth. And so that's when we came up with the recently released second edition of this book, which brings the story up to date. Now, the second way it brings the story up to date that's very important is that a few months after we left in 2007, Cyclone Gupta happened in the South Pacific. And it led to a terrific amount of flooding in Oro province, including the Maisin villages, which are all built on sandbars, surrounded by mangrove swamps. And it wiped out their food source. The gardens were covered in mud. It was absolutely devastating. People survived on gifts of rice and so forth. Maisin organized themselves enormously well compared to other people in this area. It's sort of what they do. They fight incessantly among themselves, but when a challenge comes, they somehow bring it all together. But they sent out a message that they did not want outsiders coming in. They simply could not support them until they were able to get their gardens back together, and even a few years after that. It just, again, very well organized and very sensible. So we respected that and have respected that, although at this point, my understanding is that they're okay with people coming back, and hopefully we will. And meanwhile, though, they have been fighting not just the logging situation, but the point that with global climate change, all of their villages are vulnerable to being flooded out, as are their gardens. And so where will they go? Where will they move? Well, they'll move into this interior where the rainforest is, so they could end up cutting down the rainforest themselves. So they're now struggling with this situation and what this all means. So I wanted to write about that as well, because we, of course, also are. But we're not the canaries in the gold mine. We're not the first ones who are going to be affected by it. But we will be affected by it. And here in Vancouver, a huge part of the Vancouver population lives in Richmond, and parts of Richmond are below sea level. So Vancouver Airport is only a couple of meters above, 2 or 3 meters above sea level. So we're all exposed to that here as well. So that's also been an important part of my evolution as a scholar and as an activist, is to help students connect with these places, not just as exotic, wonderful, beautiful places that make this beautiful cloth and the women tattoo themselves and all the rest of it, but also places where they're regular human beings who are experiencing what we're experiencing, because we're all connected and we're all in one world. And so that's been an important part of going back and thinking about this place. Another significant development that's happened more broadly in anthropology from when I started has been the emergence of an anthropology of Christianity. So I wanted to say a few things about that too, because it's been kind of interesting. This is not the first time I've been interviewed for something like this. The first time I was interviewed for something like this was by Bronwyn Douglas, who did not do a life history. She asked pointed questions, as Bronwyn tends to do. And her pointed questions were, how on earth did you start studying Christianity when no anthropologist would do this? And so on and so forth. And it was interesting kind of thinking about that, because, as I said before, when I went into the field at first, there was, some resistance to this topic. And it was only afterwards that I started, after I had the privilege of going back several times and working with Alan Howard on a collection on long-term field work and thinking about long-term field work, where you not only see a community change over time, but you form these very, very tight social relationships with people. They become family. And you are given family responsibilities. It's a very different relationship. Not always pleasant, but generally good. So thinking about that has been very important. I just sort of lost my line of thought there.
We were discussing about the anthropology of Christianity.
The anthropology of Christianity. So I realized afterwards that when I started writing about Christianity among the Maisin, I wrote a few articles. I put together a collection. I never did a monograph. And most of the articles I've written have been about sorcery. And most of the articles and things I've written have been about tablecloth. And when I realized that, when I look back at my notes, I've got all this stuff on sermons that I never actually used to write articles. And I realized I was doing it myself, that over the course of my career also I was kind of editing out the things because I had a notion of what anthropologists would want to read. And part of writing Ancestral Lines, by the way, was getting some freedom from thinking about what anthropologists would want to read to thinking about, well, what do I want to say and what would people who are not anthropologists like to hear or find interesting. That really was a great sense of freedom to do that. And I've since started editing this series that this book appears in to encourage other anthropologists to do the same. So that was interesting. When I did my first work in this area, there was nothing called the Anthropology of Christianity. I never thought of it as the Anthropology of Christianity. I thought of myself as an ethnographer. And the job of an ethnographer is like a job of the journalist, like my mom. Document what you see. Be honest about it. And so there's a church. People go to the church. It's a big part of their day. It's what I'm seeing. So if I look at magic to make taro, which happens, once in a blue moon, and document that, surely I should be documenting something that's happening all the time. So to me, it was just, ultimately common sense and responsibility. So I didn't think of it as something particularly special in a theoretical sense. And then I started working with younger scholars who, all of a sudden this topic is okay. And one of them was my good friend Joel Robbins, who I've known since he was a graduate student, and worked up with the Urapman people in Papua New Guinea, wrote a really phenomenal book on Urapman conversion and what it's meant for them and all the rest of it. Their experience is very different than my scene, but I think it's a very powerful model for how to think about these things. And Joel and a few others are the ones who came up with the brand, if you will, of Anthropology of Christianity. And it's been kind of interesting watching this development because I know what Joel means by it. He's trying to find a way of finding the common core of Christianity as an anthropologist, as a Dumontian anthropologist would do. His background comes from Louis Dumont, much more than mine does. And I work from the perspective of an ethnographer. And so Christianity is part of a mix. And so I find myself, although we're good friends and we have published things together and so forth, I find myself resisting the anthropology of Christianity in my own work. So it's been a kind of interesting dialogue that's going on. A few years ago, Joel arranged a Winter-Gren workshop on sort of the state of the art in the anthropology of Christianity. I was very fortunate to be involved with that. And at one point, we kind of went around the table, and more than half the people there said, I don't think of myself as an anthropologist of Christianity, although these are all people who have published a lot in this area. So that's been kind of strange and kind of weird. I sometimes get introduced now, and this makes me feel very strange, as the founder of the movement, so to speak, or as a pioneer. I've been called a pioneer in press by some people, and this is when I was younger, and I sort of said I'm not dead yet. So that's been an interesting thing too, which I think probably scholars who again fortunate enough to get good jobs and stay with them kind of experience later on, that your earlier work comes back and it kind of bites you in interesting ways and comes back at you in interesting ways. So I have been taken for task at some of the things I wrote in my foolish youth that I would not write now and things like that. But it's been very kind of stimulating thinking about these things in a very, very different way. And thinking about just how these fit with what one knows about the field as well, and also how it fits with a kind of a historical perspective on anthropology itself, I have to remind my students, because I never reminded myself in part too, that Malinowski did this fabulous work in the Trobriand Islands. He didn't stop writing after that. And he didn't write just about the Trobriand Islands. And he wrote for a long time, and he died young. And there's others like Lévi-Strauss, of course, who lived in Raymond Firth, who lived into their hundreds, and were writing right to the end. And they change over time. And we don't, but somehow when we clock people, we don't see that change. So I think this has been a very important lesson to learn that anthropologists don't only document, but they're also changing themselves. They're also very much part of what goes on. So thinking about that, I had the great privilege of working with Ken Burridge, who's I have immense respect for as a scholar. He was one of the first anthropologists to take a really historical perspective on doing ethnography in his work in millenarian movements. He was the first anthropologist to really pay attention to missionaries and Christianity in a very serious way. Immensely gifted in terms of thinking about the relationships between things and with being comfortable with complexity and not feeling like he has to explain it all. And he also has a great gift as a novelist. Actually, his very first book, people don't know this, was a novel written under a pseudonym. So it's interesting. I in some ways, I sort of chafed as a student of Ken's, and as I've gotten older, I've come more and more to appreciate the wisdom of his work and going back and seeing the degree to which it influences the way that I think about things in general. And so another project I got involved in, really initiated, was through conversation with colleagues, and so many saying, I read Mambu, which is Burridge's famous book, and that's why I came to study Melanesia. And I drew this idea, I drew that idea, and I've not thought about it much since, but when I think about it now, that's why I came in. Or this idea I got, about how this myth fits together. Well, that actually I realize now that came out of Burridge. So talking to these people, I thought, well, why don't we have a session in which we share what we learned? And so we had a session here in Vancouver, a workshop, and it brought together about a dozen people, half of whom had never met Burridge. So they weren't students, and they didn't even know he was still alive. They had not met him. And Ken was still mobile then, so he came. And we had this it was just kind of a magical session, not just because the ideas are so rich and people were doing such fascinating things with them, So, one person was looking at a Papua New Guinean Catholic nun who's going through a traditional Sepik River ceremony to give her strength prior to going to Africa to serve in a hospital mission there. Isn't that wonderful? And things like that. And then another one on a sugar factory in Papua New Guinea, and how notions of reciprocity work their way through the way the workers get into disputes with each other and settle things, even though they're paid workers and so forth. And how this sort of draws from Burridge's ideas of reciprocity and his ties in with sorcery and things of that nature. Or how up in the New Guinea highlands, there is a religious movement that's being driven mostly by women who are using the power of Christ to heal people. And this looks entirely different until you realize that there's another transformation of what's been happening in millenarian movements. They keep going through transformations that bring people into new ways to do old things. So all of those things kind of came together into this book, The Anthropology of Morality, where we brought these articles together over time, and I wrote an essay, a general essay on thinking about morality across Melanesia, not just on Burridge's work, but on all sorts of people's work, because morality really is the thing that ties this all together. And it was fun to do, and I think it was one of these things too, where this has happened to me several times in my career, where I've kind of stumbled onto a topic, whether that be Christianity or morality, that became hot right around the time I was working on it. It's not that I was planning this, but and it's not that this book is not a major book in this field by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just kind of strange that it was all kind of coming together at the same time across the field. That anthropologists started to think about morality again, having dropped the subject, from the 1930s and 40s, and here we are. And isn't this a lovely photo? This is a photo of a wedding. All the pictures I've shown you, the covers were taken by my wife, Ann Tejan. And this is a photo she took of a wedding occurring in Wanagala, of a Maisin bride and a Ubiri Wanagalan husband. And because it's a Maisin bride, there's tapa cloth that's being over the shoulder. The veil is made from mosquito netting. And it's just this wonderful kind of collage of stuff that's going on here. And of course, what you can't see in the picture is that following the wedding, there was a great night of traditional dancing and feasting. Opened up with a prayer by the local priest and so forth.